There's a specific kind of silence that exists only after everything you believed about your life turns out to be a carefully constructed lie. Not the silence of an empty room, not the silence of a sleepless night. It's the silence that lives inside you, in the space where trust used to be, hollow and cold, like a cathedral with all the saints removed. The night I discovered what Callum had done, I sat in my car, in the parking garage for 2 hours and 40 minutes without moving. I know the exact time because I watched the clock on my dashboard the entire time, counting minutes the way a man counts his remaining breaths. I wasn't crying, I wasn't angry. I was something far more dangerous than either of those things. I was calculating. And this is the story of what I calculated. Part 1. The Blueprint of a Friendship. My name is Rafael Moreno, and for 11 years, Callum Whitfield was the most important person in my life. I want you to understand what that actually means before you hear what he did, because context matters. Because betrayal without context is just a story. With context, it becomes something that changes how you see every human relationship you'll ever have again. So let me take you back. Let me take you all the way back to a Tuesday afternoon in September, 14 years ago, when 2 junior architects started at the same firm on the same day and were assigned to share a drafting table the size of a postage stamp. Hargrove and Lund was a mid-size architecture firm in Portland, Oregon. Not the glamorous kind of firm you see in design magazines, not the kind where everything is glass and exposed concrete and everyone speaks in hushed, reverent tones about negative space. Hargrove and Lund was a working firm. Municipal contracts, school renovations, the occasional corporate campus. The kind of firm where you learned your craft by doing unglamorous work exceptionally well, and where the senior partners could tell, just by glancing at a set of drawings, whether you had what it took to stay. I'd just finished my master's at Oregon State. I was 26 years old, terrified, and carrying a portfolio I'd spent 6 months obsessing over. I showed up 40 minutes early to my first day and sat in the lobby pretending to review my portfolio while actually watching the door like a man waiting for a verdict. Callum walked in at 8:54. He was my age, maybe 6 months older, with the kind of easy confidence I'd always envied. Not arrogance, nothing that turned you off, just a settled comfort in his own skin that made rooms feel a degree or two warmer. He was carrying a coffee cup in each hand and wearing a jacket that was slightly too big for him, which I'd later learn was because he'd bought it at a thrift store for $3 and just never gotten around to replacing it. Not because he couldn't afford better, but because he genuinely didn't care. He looked at me sitting in the lobby with my white-knuckled portfolio grip and said, without any preamble, "You're the other new guy." "Raphael," I said. "Callum." He held out the second coffee cup. "I didn't know you'd be here, but I always buy 2 because I drink the first one too fast and then regret it." "You drink coffee?" I took the cup. It was a simple gesture, the kind of thing that takes 3 seconds and costs almost nothing. But there's something about being handed a cup of coffee by a stranger on the first terrifying morning of your professional life that creates an instant, irrational warmth. I've thought about that moment many times since, wondering if it was calculated, wondering if even then Callum understood the social alchemy of small gestures. I don't think it was calculated, that's the honest answer. And the honest answer is what makes the whole story so much harder to tell. We were assigned to the same project within our first week, a renovation proposal for a community centre in northeast Portland. Minor project, the kind of thing the senior architect could have sketched out in an afternoon, but they gave it to us as a learning exercise and let us struggle through it together. And we did struggle. We worked late 4 nights that first week, the 2 of us hunched over that shared drafting table, arguing about load-bearing walls and window placement and budget constraints, eating bad Thai takeout from the place down the block that was somehow still open at 10 o'clock at night. Something about working late with someone builds a particular kind of intimacy that takes years to develop in ordinary social situations. You see how they think under pressure. You see how they handle frustration. You see whether they're honest when they make a mistake or whether they immediately start looking for someone to blame. Callum was honest. When he made a calculation error on the third night that cost us about 2 hours of rework, he didn't hesitate. "That's on me," he said. "I'll stay and fix it." "I'll stay too," I said. "You don't have to." "I know." He looked at me for a second, and something shifted in his expression. Something that felt, at the time, like recognition. Like he was looking at someone who operated by the same code he did. He was, or I thought he was. Over the next 3 years, Callum and I became the kind of friends that people around the office talked about. Not in a gossip way, in an admiring way mostly. The way people talk about a working partnership that just works, that produces results that neither person could have produced alone. We developed what I can only describe as a creative shorthand. I would sketch the structural bones of a concept, and he would see immediately how to dress it. He had a gift for aesthetics, for the way a building felt to be inside, that complemented my obsessive attention to structural integrity and technical precision. Together we could take a client brief and turn it into something that surprised even us. We started getting assigned to progressively larger projects. By our third year, we were the team Hargrove and Lund put on anything they wanted to impress a new client. That was unusual for architects our age, and we both knew it, and we were careful not to let it make us insufferable. Outside of work, we were just as inseparable. His wife, Diana, became one of my wife's closest friends. My daughter, Mia, who was born in our 4th year at the firm, was practically raised with their son, Oliver, who came along 6 months later. We vacationed together in the summers, rented a house on the Oregon coast for a week every July, 4 adults and eventually 4 children between us. All the chaos and laughter and sunburned shoulders that you can imagine. I'm dwelling on this because I need you to understand that what Callum and I had was not a work friendship that happened to extend to weekends. It was a life friendship. The kind where you stop editing yourself around the other person because there's no version of yourself you're hiding from them. Where you can say, "I'm scared," without qualifying it. Where you can call at midnight because your father just died and not worry about the hour. His father died in our 7th year at the firm. Late-stage pancreatic cancer, brutally fast. I drove 4 hours each way to sit with him at the hospital for 2 days straight when the end was close. I held him when he cried in that terrible, ugly, unself-conscious way that men only cry when they know no one is watching, or when the person watching is someone they trust completely. He looked at me after and said, "I don't know what I'd do without you, Raf." I believed him. I was still believing him 6 years later when I started to notice the first cracks. Part 2. Hairline fractures. The way betrayal usually works is this. When you look back afterward, the warning signs seem obvious. You wonder how you missed them. You build a case against your own powers of observation, your own judgment. You decide you must have been naive, or willfully blind, or just catastrophically stupid. But here's what I've come to understand. After everything, the warning signs only seem obvious in retrospect because you're looking at them through the lens of what you now know. In the moment, they were things that fit a dozen different explanations, most of them benign, and because you loved the person, because you trusted them at the cellular level, your brain automatically reached for the benign explanation every single time. That's not stupidity, that's loyalty. And Callum knew that. The first crack appeared in our 9th year at the firm. We were both up for the same senior associate position. This happens in every firm at some point. Two people you promote together hit a ceiling at the same time, and there's only one door open. Callum and I had talked about it openly, the way we talked about everything. We both wanted it, we both earned it. We'd agreed that whoever got it would do everything in their power to create an equivalent position for the other as soon as possible, and we'd meant it. I got the promotion. Callum was gracious about it publicly. He congratulated me in front of the partners, came to the small celebration dinner my wife organized, made a speech. But over the weeks that followed, I noticed a change in his energy that I couldn't quite name. He was still warm, still funny, still the same in most ways. But occasionally I'd catch something behind his eyes when a client addressed me as the lead. A flash of something that disappeared so fast I'd convince myself I'd imagined it. I didn't imagine it. The second crack appeared 18 months later when the Meridian Tower project came in. Meridian was the biggest project Hargrove and Lund had ever landed. A 32-story mixed-use tower in downtown Portland, commissioned by a developer named Terence Albright, who had enough money to make even the senior partners nervous with excitement. It was a $15 million contract, and I was assigned to lead it. Naturally, I brought Callum on as my co-lead. We worked on the Meridian concept for 4 months before the first major client presentation. 4 months of what felt like our best collaborative work ever. Late nights, breakthroughs at 2 a.m, arguments that sharpened both our thinking, the old rhythm that had always made us exceptional together. The presentation was a triumph. Albright's team loved it. The partners were ecstatic. That night, at dinner with our wives, Callum was effusive. "This is it," he said, raising his glass. "This is the one that changes everything." He looked at me with that warmth I'd known for a decade. "You built something incredible, Raf." 3 days later, I found out he'd had a private meeting with Terence Albright. I found out by accident. I was walking past the conference room and heard Albright's voice, which surprised me because I hadn't known he was in the building. I stopped, not eavesdropping, intentionally just orienting. Through the partially open door, I heard Callum's voice, smooth and engaged, and caught just a fragment before a passing colleague said something to me, and the moment broke. What I caught was Callum saying, "The aesthetic direction has really been my vision driving things. Raphael handles the technical compliance beautifully, but the design language..." I stood in the corridor for a full 10 seconds. Then I kept walking. That night I told myself I'd misheard, that I'd caught only a fragment without context, and the full sentence probably meant something different, that Callum was simply clarifying their respective roles to the client, which wasn't dishonest. That was the benign explanation. My brain went straight to it, because my brain had 11 years of evidence supporting Callum's good character and approximately 3 seconds of ambiguous audio suggesting otherwise. I chose the 11 years. I shouldn't have. The third crack was subtler, and it was the one that, looking back, should have triggered real alarm because it involved my career directly. Every year, the partners at Hargrove and Lund had informal conversations with senior staff about trajectory, where you saw yourself going, what kinds of projects excited you, whether you were considering a move. These weren't performance reviews, just temperature checks, the kind of conversation where you could float ambitions without them feeling like formal demands. In my annual conversation with Edmund Hargrove, the senior founding partner, who was in his late 60s by then and beginning to think about succession, I mentioned, for the first time explicitly, that I was interested in equity partnership when the opportunity arose. Edmund had nodded thoughtfully, said it was a conversation worth having in the right time and context, and that I was certainly one of the people they'd be considering. Nothing was promised, nothing was guaranteed, but it was a real conversation, and it mattered. I told Callum about it that same afternoon, over coffee in the little courtyard behind the office. I told him because I told him everything, and because part of me hoped it would open the door for him to have the same conversation, because I genuinely wanted us both to get there. He listened, asked a few questions, nodded, said it sounded positive. He seemed, if anything, slightly distracted. I assumed he was processing his own feelings about not having had a similar conversation yet, and I let it be. What I didn't know, what I wouldn't know for over a year, was that 3 days after I told him about my conversation with Edmund, Callum had scheduled his own meeting with Edmund and the other founding partner, Gerald Lund. And in that meeting, Callum had said something that I will spend the rest of my life trying to understand how he could have said. He told them he was concerned about my leadership on Meridian. He said he'd been observing patterns of decision-making that gave him pause. He framed it carefully. Not an accusation, just concern. The concern of a deeply loyal friend who felt obligated to raise something he'd been sitting with for a while. He cited 3 specific instances of what he called judgment lapses on technical decisions, which were, in reality, choices I'd made deliberately and with full documentation of my reasoning, choices that in context were entirely defensible, out of context, presented by someone the partners trusted implicitly, by someone they knew had worked alongside me for nearly a decade and therefore couldn't possibly be motivated by anything other than genuine concern. Out of that context, they sounded like warning signs. I didn't know any of this was happening. I was leading Meridian. I was doing the best work of my career. And somewhere behind me, the man I trusted most in the world was quietly, methodically, carefully removing the rungs from the ladder I was climbing. Party 3. The collapse. The Meridian Tower project was completed, from initial concept to construction completion, over a period of 3 years. It was, objectively, a success. The building won 2 regional design awards. Architectural Digest ran a 4-page feature on it. Terence Albright, at the completion celebration, stood up and gave a speech praising the design vision and execution. He mentioned Callum by name twice. He mentioned me once, in passing, as part of the team. I noticed, of course I noticed, but I told myself it was a client's natural affinity for a personality, not a reflection of reality. I told myself that the partners knew the truth. I told myself that the work spoke for itself. The partnership conversation with Edmund Hargrove that I'd been anticipating never materialized into anything formal. When I finally raised it explicitly, 2 months after Meridian's completion, at what felt like the right moment, Edmund was warm but measured. He said they were in the middle of a structural assessment of the firm's leadership model. He said my contributions were valued. He said nothing concrete. 3 weeks later, the firm announced that Callum Whitfield was being elevated to equity partner. I found out in a company-wide email. I want to describe what that felt like, but language has limits. There's a specific physical sensation that comes with a betrayal of this magnitude, a kind of cold nausea that starts in your chest and moves outward, and a simultaneous feeling of weightlessness that isn't pleasant at all, more like the floor disappearing beneath you. I read the email 3 times, sitting at my desk while the office around me continued its normal morning activity. Callum stopped by my desk an hour later. He looked something I still struggle to name. Uncomfortable, not guilty, or not only guilty. More like a man who has been holding a secret so long it's become load-bearing in his personality, and he's genuinely uncertain what happens to the structure now that it's out. "Raf," he said. "Congratulations," I said. My voice was completely even. I surprised myself. He looked at me for a moment. "I want to talk about this." "There's nothing to talk about, Callum. It's good news for you. It's good for the firm." He started to say something else, and I turned back to my screen. After a moment, He walked away. That evening, I told my wife, Serena, what had happened. She held my face in her hands and looked at me with the specific kind of calm that she had always reserved for the moments when she could see I was about to come apart. And she said, "Tell me everything, from the beginning." So I did. And somewhere in the middle of telling her, somewhere in the middle of laying out the fragments that I'd explained away individually, but which were now lined up in sequence and refusing to be explained away, I stopped talking and sat very still. "Raf," Serena said quietly. "He did it on purpose," I said, not a question, not really even a revelation. More like a door opening onto something I'd known was there for months but hadn't let myself enter. "You don't know that for certain," she said. She was always fairer to people than I was. "You need to find out what actually happened before you—" "I know," I said. And I did know, but she was right. I needed evidence. I needed facts. And I needed to understand exactly how deep this went before I made a single move. I'd spent 13 years designing structures that had to hold weight. I knew more than most people about the importance of understanding a foundation before you try to dismantle it. So I waited, and I started to look. The full extent of what Callum had done took me 7 weeks to uncover. I want to be precise about this because precision mattered enormously to me throughout the process, both as a character trait and as a practical strategy. I didn't go looking for evidence with rage-sharpened vision, the kind that finds what it's looking for, whether it's there or not. I went looking with the cold, methodical attention I'd apply to any structural analysis. I followed facts. I went where they led. I started with Terence Albright. I reached out to Albright's office under the pretext of following up on a post-project questionnaire, something routine enough that his assistant didn't think twice about it. Over the course of that conversation, I guided the discussion toward the Meridian design narrative, specifically around how Albright and his team had come to understand the creative vision and the roles of the people involved. What I learned was that Albright had received, over the course of the project, a series of what he described as background conversations with Callum, casual coffees, occasional calls. In those conversations, Callum had consistently positioned himself as the creative driver of the project, not through explicit claims, but through the way he discussed ideas, the way he said my approach to the facade and the direction I wanted to take the lobby. He never said Raphael is secondary. He just never mentioned Raphael except in the context of execution. 3 years of carefully seeded narrative, and it had worked. I kept my voice completely neutral through that conversation. I thanked Albright, finished the call, and sat at my desk for a long time. Then I went further. Through a colleague who'd left Hargrove and Lund 2 years earlier, a woman named Priscilla who'd always liked me and had no particular reason to protect anyone's reputation now that she was elsewhere, I learned about a conversation she'd witnessed between Callum and Gerald Lund at an industry event. A conversation she'd always felt vaguely uncomfortable about but had never found a reason to raise. In that conversation, Callum had expressed deep, private concern about whether I was the right person to be the face of a firm at partnership level. He'd cited my difficulty with client relationships, which was laughable as I had excellent client relationships. And more damningly, he'd mentioned those 3 technical judgment lapses again. It wasn't one conversation, it was a campaign, slow, careful, invisible, built over years, built with the intimacy and credibility that only a person in my innermost circle could have deployed. He'd used everything I'd ever trusted him with, my professional vulnerabilities, my communication style, my moments of doubt, and reverse-engineered them into a case against me that was persuasive precisely because it came from a source that had every reason to be loyal. The last thing I found was the email. I won't go into the details of exactly how I found it, only that it involved an administrative assistant who'd resigned under difficult circumstances 8 months earlier, and who, when I asked her a specific enough question in a careful enough way, provided me with information she'd been sitting on out of sheer moral discomfort. The email was from Callum to Edmund Hargrove, sent 14 months before the partnership announcement. It was 3 paragraphs long. The first paragraph was warm and collegial and concerned. The second paragraph systematically and specifically undermined my candidacy for any equity role at the firm. The third paragraph, framed as pure transparency, mentioned that Callum himself had thought deeply about whether he could see a long-term future at Hargrove and Lund, given certain concerns about direction, and the kind of carefully coded message that senior partners at any firm understand immediately. If you want to keep me, here's what you need to decide. He had given them an ultimatum, wrapped in the language of concern, using me as the lever, and it had worked. I drove home that night, the night I found the email, and sat in the parking garage of my building for 2 hours and 40 minutes. This is where I started, the silence inside me, the calculating. I went upstairs. Serena was still awake. She took one look at my face and said nothing, just made tea and waited. I laid it all out for her. Everything. The Albright narrative, Priscilla's account, the email, all of it. She listened without interrupting, which was unusual for her. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "What are you going to do?" "I don't know yet," I said. "Are you going to confront him?" I thought about it. Really thought about it. The answer surprised me a little. "No," I said. Not yet. Maybe not at all." I looked at my hands. If I confront him, he knows what I know. And if he knows what I know, I lose every advantage I have. Serena looked at me steadily. "What advantage?" I looked back at her. "He thinks I'm still his friend." Part 4. The Architecture of Retribution. Let me be honest about what the following months were like on the inside. People who haven't been through something like this sometimes imagine that the decision to pursue revenge, or whatever you want to call it, justice, recalibration, whatever word makes it easier to live with, is a kind of liberation. Like once you have a plan, the pain stops, like purpose burns away grief. It doesn't. What I experienced in the year after discovering what Callum had done was the most psychologically complex period of my life. I continued working at Hargrove and Lund, continued my professional relationship with Callum, continued, God help me, the social dinners and the occasional weekend with our families. I smiled at him. I asked about his son. I discussed project challenges with him over lunch. I did all of this while carrying knowledge that was like a live wire running through everything I touched. The performance was brutal, not because I'm a dishonest person, I'm not, but because performing normalcy while feeling exactly the opposite of normal requires a kind of sustained internal fracture that I genuinely don't recommend. There were moments, particularly in the first few months, when I would be sitting across from him at a restaurant, listening to him talk, and a wave of grief so intense it almost had color would move through me. Not anger, grief. Because before the anger, before the calculation, there was the simple devastation of losing something I'd thought was real. 11 years. They had been real. I still believe that, or I believe it as much as I believe anything anymore. I believe that for most of those years, Callum had genuinely valued me, genuinely loved me in the way men love their closest friends. I believe the corruption was gradual, that the ambition crept in slowly, that he started making small compromises with his conscience and then found that each one made the next one easier. until one day he was writing a career-destroying email about his closest friend and justifying it to himself in ways I can barely imagine. That doesn't make it better. If anything, it makes it worse. It means the friendship was real and he still chose to do what he did. Understanding that was the hardest thing I've ever had to do. My plan came together over about 8 months. I'm going to be honest about the process, because the process matters. This was not a scheme born of rage. It was not impulsive or emotional or reckless. It was patient and architectural, which is, after all, what I'm trained to be. The first decision I made was to leave Hargrove and Lund on my own terms and on my own timeline. Not immediately, not in a way that looked like flight. I spent the first 3 months quietly building relationships with 3 other firms in Portland and 2 in Seattle, having conversations that I framed as exploratory and allowed to develop naturally. I was, by any objective measure, one of the more accomplished architects of my generation in the Pacific Northwest. I had led a 32-story mixed-use tower that had won regional awards and been featured in a national publication. The conversations were not difficult to initiate. By the end of the 3rd month, I had 2 genuine partnership track offers, one from a firm in Seattle called Brennan Stall, which was mid-size and growing aggressively, and one from a boutique firm here in Portland called Veste Architecture that was small but extraordinarily prestigious, the kind of firm that won international awards and attracted the best commissions. I took a week to decide between them and chose Veste. The decision to choose Veste was not random. It was the first move on the board. Veste Architecture had been pursuing the Cascadia Cultural Center Commission, a $45 million public arts complex funded by a regional philanthropic consortium, for nearly 2 years. It was, in the Pacific Northwest architectural community, the most significant pending commission of the decade. Hargrove and Lund was also pursuing it. So was Callum. When I joined Veste as senior associate with a partnership track agreement in the contract, I brought with me my entire body of work, my professional network, and, crucially, my relationships with 2 members of the philanthropic board that oversaw the Cascadia Commission. Not relationships I'd cultivated for strategic purposes, genuine professional relationships built over years of community involvement and professional credibility that Vesta didn't have and Hargrove and Lund didn't know they were losing. I gave 2 weeks' notice at Hargrove and Lund. Edmund Hargrove asked if anything was wrong. I told him I'd been offered an extraordinary opportunity and that, after careful reflection, I'd decided the timing was right for a change. I was professional. I was warm. I thanked him for everything. Callum asked to meet for coffee on my last day. I agreed. He sat across from me with an expression I can only describe as carefully composed. "I'm not going to pretend I'm not worried about this," he said. "There's nothing to worry about," I said. "You're a partner now. The firm is in good hands." "I mean about us," he said. "About our friendship." I looked at him for a moment, studied his face with the attention I usually reserved for structural drawings. Then I said, "Callum, you are my oldest friend. Nothing changes that." He exhaled slowly. "Good," he said, "because you know I know," I said. We finished our coffee. I shook his hand. I walked out. My first 6 months at Vesta were the most energizing professional period of my life. Part of it was relief, the relief of being somewhere that I'd chosen rather than somewhere I'd been undermined. And part of it was genuine intellectual stimulation. Veste operated at a level of design ambition that pushed me, that required me to reach for things I'd been coasting past in my later years at Hargrove and Lund. But I was also working, not just on the design projects, on the Cascadia Commission specifically. The 2 board members I knew from my network were Solange Mercer, a philanthropist with a background in fine arts who cared passionately about the cultural mission of the project, and Victor Osei Bonsu, a civic architect who had served on the board for years and was widely considered its most influential voice. Both of them knew my work. Both of them respected it. Neither of them had any idea what was about to happen. What I brought to the Cascadia process through Vesta was not manipulation. I want to be clear about that because I think it matters. I didn't poison the well against Hargrove and Lund. I didn't undermine Callum's work or whisper concerns in the right ears. That would have made me what he was. What I did was simpler and more devastating. I was excellent. I led Vesta's Cascadia proposal with the full force of everything I had, my technical precision, my design vision, and a deep understanding of what the Commission Board actually cared about, gained through years of genuine relationships with people like Solange and Victor. Our proposal was not just good, it was the best thing I'd ever created. 12 months of focused, obsessive work, and every decision was right. Part 5. The Reckoning. The Cascadia Commission announcement was made on a Thursday afternoon in November. Vesta Architecture won it. I was in the office when the call came in. The managing partner, a remarkable woman named Ingrid Hausmann, shouted it across the floor, and there was a spontaneous eruption of sound, cheers, laughter. Someone spilled coffee that I felt outside of slightly, the way you sometimes feel outside of moments your body is physically present in, but your mind is somewhere else entirely. My mind was at Hargrove and Lund. I didn't celebrate excessively that night. I went home, had dinner with Serena and our daughters, and helped with homework and bath time the way I did every night. After the kids were in bed, Serena poured 2 glasses of wine and sat down across from me. "It happened," I said. "I know," she said. She'd seen the industry announcement online. "How do you feel?" I thought about it. "Like I just tightened the first bolt on something that's been under construction for a long time," I said. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Raf, is this enough? Is winning the commission enough?" "No," I said. She nodded slowly, unsurprised. "What else needs to happen?" "The industry needs to know the truth about who did what at Meridian." The architectural community in the Pacific Northwest is not large. It operates like most professional communities of its size, with conference circuits and publication networks and the informal social infrastructure that connects people across firms. Reputations are built and maintained through that infrastructure. They're also destroyed through it. I had spent 13 years in that community. I had genuine credibility, genuine relationships, and now a very large and very visible commission that would be discussed and covered and written about for years. When the coverage of the Cascadia Commission began, and it began quickly because it was a significant story, I was interviewed by every regional publication that covered architecture and design. And in those interviews, I was consistent, measured, and precise. I spoke about design philosophy. I spoke about the challenges of public cultural spaces. I spoke about the team at Vesta. And when journalists, as journalists inevitably do, asked about my career trajectory and about my years at Hargrove and Lund, about Meridian Tower, about what had shaped my approach, I answered carefully and with complete accuracy. I talked about what my role had actually been on Meridian, not angrily, not as a polemic against anyone, just straightforwardly with the specificity of someone who had designed and documented and led every major decision and had the records to support it. I talked about the structural innovations that were mine. I talked about the design choices that had come out of my vision. I talked about the technical challenges I'd solved. The record existed. It had always existed in dated documents, in correspondence, in the construction drawings that bore my name and signature. The record had been obscured by narrative, but narrative can't actually alter documentation. What I was doing through interview after interview was simply making the record visible again. And the contrast Between the record and the narrative Callum had constructed, it was obvious to anyone in the industry who bothered to look. Some of them bothered to look. The first conversation I heard about came through Priscilla, who was still a useful and willing conduit for information. Someone at a firm principals dinner had commented on the discrepancy between how Callum had presented his role in Meridian, which he'd been doing in his own interviews since becoming partner, and what the documentation actually showed. The comment had been mild, the kind of thing that floats across a dinner table and gets filed away, but it had been made. The second came from Victor Osebonsu, who mentioned to me in the context of congratulating me on the Cascadia win that he'd heard some interesting background about the Meridian project. He didn't elaborate, and I didn't press. I just nodded and said the record spoke for itself. "It does," he said. By the end of that year, a quiet but unmistakable recalibration was occurring in how the industry perceived the two principles of the Meridian project. Not a scandal, not a dramatic takedown, something more precise and more lasting, a correction. And then came the Whitmore proposal. The Whitmore Group was a significant development company based in Seattle, and they were planning a flagship mixed-use project in Portland's Pearl District. 40 stories, estimated budget of $60 million, the kind of commission that would define a firm's decade. They were in the process of selecting an architect. Hargrove and Lund was one of 3 finalists. Callum was leading their proposal. I knew this because the architectural community is not large and information moves through it. I also knew it because Callum had mentioned it to me. We were still in contact, still maintained the fiction of friendship, though it had become increasingly attenuated by that point. He'd mentioned it casually, the way he'd always discussed professional developments with me. Old habit? What I'd known for some time, and hadn't mentioned to him, was that Vesta had a prior relationship with the Whitmore Group's lead investor, a man named Douglas Park, who had provided funding for a smaller project we'd completed 2 years prior. Douglas Park, who had, through his investment manager, specifically expressed interest in Vesta being in consideration for the Pearl District project. I hadn't pursued it. Not because I couldn't, but because I was waiting. 6 weeks before the Whitmore selection decision was due, I had lunch with Douglas Park. We talked about Cascadia for about 20 minutes, because that was what he wanted to talk about, and then the Pearl District project came up naturally, as I would be committed to leading whatever would be committed to leading whatever proposal we submitted. He asked me a direct question. What do you think differentiates what you'd bring to this versus what Hargrove and Lund would bring? I answered it directly. I talked about approach. I talked about vision. I talked about what my design language would bring to that specific site and that specific community. I was specific and compelling. At no point did I say anything negative about Hargrove and Lund or about Callum. I didn't need to. The industry conversation was doing that work for me, quietly, in the background, the way a structural problem does its slow work before the building finally shows. The stress. Vesta was added to the Whitmore proposal process 3 weeks later. The Whitmore selection process took 4 months. I threw everything I had into it. In the way I'd thrown everything into Cascadia, in the way I'd thrown everything into every significant project of my career, because that's simply how I work. I designed something I was genuinely proud of. Vesta won it. The Whitmore Commission announcement ran in 3 regional publications and 2 national architecture journals. In every piece, my name was attached to the project. My vision was described in my own words, documented in my own language, connected to my own documented track record. Hargrove and Lund's 3rd consecutive loss of a major regional commission in the same period generated its own quiet commentary in the industry. The kind that doesn't appear in print but circulates through principals' dinners and conference hallways. Callum's name came up in those conversations in ways that were increasingly uncomfortable. Ingrid Houseman, who had watched all of this unfold with the combination of satisfaction and slight wariness that characterized her personality, sat down with me after the Whitmore announcement. "I want to ask you something," she said. "Go ahead. There's a story in the industry right now about Meridian Tower and the credit for it. I've been hearing things for months." She studied me. "Did you architect that story?" I met her eyes. I gave accurate interviews about my own work. The rest followed from the record. She was quiet for a moment. "Fair enough," she said finally. "The record does tend to follow people around." "Yes," I said. "It does." Part 6. The Conversation. 8 months after the Whitmore win, Callum called me. I'd been expecting the call, not the exact timing, but the inevitability of it. There are only so many ways the accumulating weight of consequences can move before they force a conversation. "I need to see you," he said. His voice was different, not the practiced warmth I was used to, but something tighter. Stripped. "All right," I said. We met at a coffee shop on the east side of Portland, the kind of anonymous place where no one was likely to know us. He was already there when I arrived. He looked, I'll say it plainly, like a man who hadn't been sleeping, like a man who'd been running a performance for a long time and had finally run out of the energy to maintain it. He didn't say hello, he just looked at me and said, "You know." Not a question. "Yes," I said. I sat down. The silence between us then was different from every silence we'd shared in 11 years of friendship. It had weight and edges. It was the silence of a structure under load. Something holding for now, but not indefinitely. "When did you find out?" he said. 2 years before I left the firm." He closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, they were, I don't know how to say this except plainly devastated, not performatively, actually devastated. "I don't expect you to believe this," he said, "but there was a period when I genuinely convinced myself it was justified, that I was actually the better candidate for partnership, and you'd gotten the promotion unfairly, and I was just—" He stopped. "That's not true. I'm not going to say that to you. I knew it wasn't true even then. I just needed a story I could live with." I looked at him. I didn't say anything. The email to Edmund. He said it like he was placing something on the table between us that he wished he could take back. I've thought about it every day since I sent it. Every single day. "Good," I said. He absorbed that. "Are you done? Or is there more?" I considered the question carefully, the way I considered all questions I'd thought about for a long time before anyone asked them. "I'm done," I said. "Everything I did by being excellent at my work and honest about my record. I didn't lie about you to anyone. I didn't destroy anything you hadn't already made fragile." He was quiet. "What I wanted," I said, "was for the record to be correct, for the industry to understand what actually happened on Meridian and what didn't, for the opportunities that were redirected away from me to redirect back. I have those things now." "And us?" he said. I looked at him for a long moment, at the face I'd known for 14 years, at the person who had been, for most of that time, one of the most significant relationships of my life, at the person who had chosen, at a critical moment, a version of himself that I didn't recognize and couldn't forgive. "But there is no us anymore, Callum," I said. "That ended the day you wrote the email, not when I found out. The day you wrote it, you made that choice and you don't get to unmake it now that it's cost you something." He nodded once. His eyes were bright. "The friendship was real," I said. "For most of it. I know that. And I think you know I know that, which is probably the hardest part of this for you." "It is," he said. "Good," I said again. Then you understand everything. I finished my coffee. I put on my jacket. I looked at him one more time. I hope the work you're doing is honest, I said. I genuinely do, not because of anything to do with me. Just because you were once a remarkable architect, and it would be a waste if you weren't anymore. I walked out. I sat in my car in the parking lot for about 3 minutes. Not the 2 hours and 40 minutes of that first night in the garage. 3 minutes. And then I drove home to my wife and my daughters and the life I'd rebuilt from the ground up with my own hands. Epilogue. Vesta Architecture has now completed both the Cascadia Cultural Centre and the Whitmore Pearl development. Both projects have received national recognition. Both are, I believe, among the finest buildings in Portland. Every line of them is mine, documented, verifiable, unambiguous. I was made equity partner at Vest 18 months ago. Callum remains at Hargrove and Lund. The firm has not landed a major commission in the region in over 2 years. He is, by all accounts, still talented. Whether he's happy, I genuinely don't know. I've stopped tracking it. Diana, his wife, sent Serena a message about 8 months after our coffee shop conversation. It was kind and careful, and clearly written by a woman trying to hold together the fragments of something that had once been whole. Serena read it and cried a little, which I understood. The 4 of us had been something real. The children had grown up alongside each other. I told Serena to reply if she wanted to. That's her decision to make, not mine. Some things can't be recovered, but that doesn't mean the people attached to them are accountable for what someone else chose to destroy. Mia asked me once. She's 12 now, old enough to understand more than we think. Why we didn't see Oliver's family anymore. I thought about what to say for a long time. Sometimes I said finally, when someone does something that hurts a friendship very badly, you can forgive it, but you can't go back to how things were before. Not because you're still angry, but because you need to protect the energy you have for the people who've earned it. She thought about that. Did Oliver's dad do something bad? He made some choices, I said, that cost him something very important. And he knew what he was doing. She nodded slowly, with the particular gravity that children sometimes deploy when they're processing something adult and painful and slightly beyond their frame, but not entirely out of range. That's sad, she said. Yes, I said. It is. And it is. That's the part of this that I'm not sure ever stops being true. The satisfaction of having my record restored, of having built something new and excellent from the wreckage of what Callum did, that's real. The closure of that parking lot conversation, of having said what I needed to say and walked away without flinching, that's real too. But the loss of what we were before he chose what he chose is also real. It doesn't cancel the satisfaction. It exists alongside it. I used to think that people who said things like the betrayal hurt more than the consequences were being sentimental or imprecise. Now I think they were being exact. Callum didn't just try to take my partnership. He took 11 years of friendship and retroactively infected them with doubt, with the question that will never fully leave me. How much of it was ever real? You can rebuild a career. You can rebuild your professional standing, your reputation, your sense of your own excellence. You cannot fully rebuild the capacity for uncomplicated trust that you had before you learned what people you love are capable of. What you can do, what I did, is decide that the loss is not going to be the definition of what comes next. My daughters are healthy and bright and full of opinions about everything, the way daughters should be. Serena and I are, if anything, closer for having navigated this together. for having made the decision to respond with patience and precision rather than chaos and rage. We sit on the roof deck of our house on summer evenings and watch the light change over the mountains and talk about everything and nothing, and sometimes I think about the parking garage and the silence and the calculating, and I feel something I can only describe as peace. Not the peace of forgetting, the peace of having done the work. Not the peace of resolution, exactly. The peace of accuracy, of having made sure the record was correct, of having stood in the ruins of something you believed in and built something better from the same materials. There's a principle in architecture, one I've thought about a great deal since all of this, called structural redundancy. The idea is that a well-designed building doesn't depend on any single element for its integrity. If one beam fails, the load redistributes. The structure holds. I built a life with Callum Whitfield as a central support. When he chose to become something I hadn't accounted for, I had to learn that the life hadn't been the structure I thought it was, that the structure was actually me, my values, my work ethic, my commitment to honesty and precision, my marriage, my family, my own sense of who I am. Those things held. The rest, the friendship, the shared history, the 11 years of trust, those redistributed. They became something else, not nothing, something that informed everything that came after without defining it. Weight that I learned to carry rather than bear. And the man who tried to remove me from the blueprint of my own life? He's still in it, just not the way he planned. The record is correct now. That's all I ever really wanted. And some nights, on the roof deck, with the light going gold over the mountains and Serena's hand in mine, some nights that feels like everything.